Terry, we appreciate you coming back again, and you're here at a time where there is, without question, a crisis at the border. It's humanitarian, it's a drug crisis, it's an immigration crisis. Just to put some numbers around it, if you could help us, just so people can understand what's going on. My sense is there are now over 100,000 people coming to the border. My sense is there's about a 75% increase compared to last year in the number of children who are showing up at the border, and about a 400% increase in the number of families coming to the border. So not only higher numbers, but more families with children. Is that accurate?
That's exactly correct.
So it's overwhelming. And we appreciate your service and the service of the men and women of CBP and the Border Patrol who are trying to deal with this issue, many of whom are being pulled off their normal jobs, as I understand it, to deal with the humanitarian crisis. Is that accurate?
That's very true. I mean, the processing and care of families and children is much more intensive, and to have 40% of our Border Patrol agents engaged just in that function, not on the line, not addressing the border security parts of their mission, is a crisis by any measure. And I know you've been committed, Senator, to countering the drug epidemic in our country, especially the synthetic opioid concerns. I'm very concerned we're missing drugs right now on that border due to this crisis.
We're seeing on the drug front is pretty scary because we have finally some progress on the opioid front. For the first time in 8 years, we've seen some decrease in overdose deaths. But what's happening in my state of Ohio and around the country is you see a lot more crystal meth coming in from Mexico. It's pure, it's powerful, it's inexpensive. Frankly, there aren't any more the meth labs in places like Ohio. Why? Because it's so darn inexpensive and so powerful to just buy the stuff from the cartels coming up from Mexico. So, yeah, heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, but now pure crystal meth. On that, since you raise it, what is the single most important thing that we could do today to stop the crystal meth from coming across the border?
So the FY19 budget does a tremendous amount for us in this regard, and we're going to deploy those resources. Non-intrusive inspection technology for the southern border going to be able to dramatically increase the percentage of vehicles that we scan. It's going to be the single best tool we have to stop the increase in crystal meth.
So it's a new technology that we have funded to be able to see if there's a truck coming through, for instance, through a non-invasive technology to be able, to essence, to see whether there are drugs there and then to be able to apprehend.
Right. The two additional points I would make, though, is the investments in the border wall and the system around that, the cameras, the lighting, the roads that allow us to gain access. That will help us address the increasing incidence of hard narcotics coming between ports of entry. And then third, resolving this crisis so our agents can be back focused on the border security aspects of their mission.
Not pulled off for the humanitarian.
Three things I would highlight.
Yeah. Let's talk about push and pull factors for a second, because ultimately what we're trying to do here in this committee is to help you to be able to address this issue. On the push side, we talk a lot about the Northern Triangle countries being countries where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of corruption and reasons for people to want to leave. So we've talked about how to get aid and have it be more effectively deployed in those countries. I think there's a general consensus among at least members of this committee that we should do a better job and can. However, we're still going to have huge wage differentials. There's still going to be issues in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala that cannot be addressed simply by aid packages. So what are the pull factors? It seems to me that the most important one right now, given this, again, 400% increase in families, 75% increase in kids, over 100,000 people a month now coming over that border, is there's something going on with the asylum system because they're coming over to seek asylum. They're coming to your officers. They're not trying to avoid law enforcement. In fact, the wall probably is not helpful in this regard in the sense that they aren't trying to climb over a wall. They're coming forward and saying that they would like to get asylum. Tell us what happens, if you could, to these families when they approach one of your officers and ask for asylum. Are these individuals being processed? Are they being detained? Are they being allowed to go into the community? What's happening today?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Senator, on the pull factors. And I would actually use your committee's chart on this point because you see in FY15 there, Flores reinterpreted. That's been the essential driver, frankly, for the increased family units, is the fact that family units can no longer be detained together in an appropriate setting during a fair and expeditious proceeding to determine whether they have a valid asylum claim or other immigration rights.
Or said that those family members of their children there are limited to 20 days, and that's in an emergency, and otherwise they have to be released into the community. Is that accurate?
That's correct. And that certainty and knowledge that they'll be allowed to stay in the U.S. indefinitely, pending a court proceeding that could be years away, depending on what jurisdiction they're in, is a huge draw. The smugglers have capitalized on that. They're advertising that fact. We hear that routinely from our interviews with families. We see that in the media.
What percent of those families who come up to the border and, again, approach your officer, ask for asylum, are being released into the community within days?
No, 100%.
100%.
Yeah, and they're not necessarily asking for asylum. They don't have to. They can go into an immigration proceeding and not have to present that case for
And when they go
potentially years.
into the community, you say it can take a while. It's over 2 years in Ohio, you should know, before we can have a court hearing. So
Right.
it's over a 2-year period. What's the average around the country, do you know?
The average is around 2 years. In some
around
jurisdictions, it's
2
even longer.
2 years before the immigration hearing takes place.
Right.
And during that time period, can those individuals work?
Yes, by and large, although we're looking at tightening the rules so that there's not an opportunity to take advantage of the system.
So they have a work permit. My understanding is they don't get the work permit immediately, but after a certain period of time, is it 6 weeks?
Right now, it's in the 30 to 90 days range. That's correct.
Mm-hmm. And those individuals then are going to work. So if you're a trafficker, what you're telling people is, one, if you come to the border and seek asylum, or even if you're coming to the border and seeking an immigration hearing,
Right.
you'll be released into the community for a couple of years at least before your hearing, and you'll have the ability to work. And with a wage differential, being able to make 10 times as much or sometimes as much as 20 times as much in the United States, do you think that is a factor?
I think that not only is it a factor, that is directly how smugglers are advertising the opportunity to come to the U.S. right now.
So ultimately, it comes down to the jobs.
Right?
We want to talk more about E-Verify at some point because we don't have a system now to determine who's legal and who's not in our country, and we need to increase the mandatory use of E-Verify. But thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Now, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Portman.